Hey, I just wanted to talk for about like 10 or 15 minutes while I'm brewing tea. I gotta go to work later, so I won't have much time to talk, and I apologize if I seem a little bit nervous or out of breath. It's a lot earlier in the morning, which you know, I have a difficult time in the morning. But I just kind of wanted to vlog about a quick idea real quick. I just had basically a theophany and a revelation while I was outside smoking. A piece of pine bark that was up on the roof. The wind had blown the pine bark onto the ground, and I heard it scrape, and I was like, what is that? And I look around, and I see this little hunk of pine bark on the ground. So I'm like, and I was literally just pining away, uh, barking in this sense to a female, so the moon in this sense, right? Barking at the moon. Um, but here lately, due to my specific lifestyle and my diet and everything like that, I've been relating with trees a lot lately. So what I kind of wanted to vlog about is something that I'm going to make future videos on, but I kind of wanted to just do a quick one real quick through a vlog. And that is the parallels between the New Testament and A Song of Ice and Fire, or as most people know it, the Game of Thrones books, which Game of Thrones is just called the first book, but the whole series is called The Song of Ice and Fire. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is due to research that has been done by David Lightbringer, aka LML, on YouTube, and his research of symbolism and things like that within that series of books, Song of Ice and Fire, written by George R.R. Martin. And so basically, one of the things, or one of the symbols, one of the themes that lies at the core of that whole story are these trees known as the weirwood trees. And they are basically a gateway, or a portal to the realm of magic, and that has a lot of parallels with, for instance, the New Testament and Jesus Christ. Now, the thing to note here is that the weirwood trees act as like a sort of net for the green seers to basically access and look through the eyes of the trees in this sense, or to sort of tap into what they can hear through the wind and the spirit, because spirit just means breath, and what is breath but the air, right? But one of the major themes regarding that, I'm not going to go too deep in the symbolism of that. If you want to know more about that, go check out David Lightbringer. But and I'll talk more about it later on. But one of the things about the trees is that in the story, they are essentially, I guess, hijacked or infiltrated. They're intruded upon by a certain character. And basically what he does is he violates the trees in order to gain their power in this sense. And later on, through the conclusion of the story, which we are still waiting for the last two books, just trying to be patient with George, because we know that he's doing something really good for those people who study these kinds of things. Basically, it's the redemption of the trees, or it's the restoration of the trees, right? And by doing so, restoring peace to the land, right? It's going back to respecting the trees, which is ultimately a larger idea of respecting nature. And I just kind of wanted to show a little parallel with the Holy Bible, and that is, so there, the tree, first off, I want to mention, is a highly symbolic thing within not only A Song of Ice and Fire, but also within real-world mythology and real-world metaphysics. The Kabbalah, as I've talked about many times before, is also known as the tree of knowledge, the tree of life, this and that. And what it represents is the spinal cord and all the organs that lay along its nexus, right, along its the axis, and all the geometry and the mathematics go back to this and connect it to the breath, and the different chakras are also known as the fruit. In fact, so going to the very beginning of the holy book of Genesis, what happens? Well, God basically tells Adam and Eve to not violate this specific tree by eating of its fruit. Leave it be. In a sense, before they ate the fruit, they were innocent, in other words. And by eating that, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they gained higher awareness, right? And then they were basically held accountable for higher metaphysical events that would take place as life goes on. Basically, it's a human consciousness metaphor for the awakening of life. Hence why the serpent tricks them, because the serpent represents that lower base nature traveling up the spine through the kundalini and wanting to fly. And the flying aspect is, and this is something that's very heavy in A Song of Ice and Fire, is that the flying aspect is the consciousness traveling outwards, right? Whenever you see symbolism of flying, for instance, of flying animals or anything like that, what it's representing is the flight of the consciousness, or the flight of the soul to higher realms in that sense, and psychic powers and things like that. Hence why when Adam and Eve ate the fruit, they gained higher awareness. Now I want to bring up another thing, which, by the way, the particular person who invaded the Weirwoods was Azor Ahai, who is symbolically represented to have penetrated into them by the killing of his wife Nissa Nissa with the magic sword Lightbringer. And Nissa Nissa represents the trees. So I just want to let you know that. There's many different Nissa Nissa character parallels throughout the book, and if you check out their symbolism, they represent the trees. So it's him breaking into or hijacking nature is what it represents, right? Raping nature and taking it. So, and he represents a dragon character, right? Hence, his flaming sword and all of that. And again, the dragon being related to the serpent. So in Norse mythology, I want to point out something. Odin basically hangs himself from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 days until he, and I'm still learning Norse mythology, but I'm pretty sure he plucked out his eye, right? Or he stabbed his eye and then hung himself upside down on Yggdrasil for 9 days until he found the runes. Basically, what it represents is a sacrifice of his physical body for higher spiritual awareness, because as soon as he gained the runes, it's like he gained a spiritual power in that sense, like a spiritual sense. And the runes, just to let you know, are characters. They are letters. So it's talking about language, right? Because again, language is, at its root, the word is something of God, like the word of God, right? Which ultimately represents sound in and of itself. Intelligent sound with meaning, which is what both words or language and music is. So basically Adam and Eve corrupted nature. They corrupted the world through their sins, right? By the violation of a tree, okay? Now, going forward all the way into Hebrews, if I'm not mistaken, it's Hebrews in the New Testament. So long past the four Gospels. Paul, again, if I'm not mistaken, is talking about the distinction between Adam and Christ, where he says basically like the sins of one man corrupted the entirety of mankind. And then he goes on to say how the sacrifice or the death of God's Son redeemed all of mankind. So he's making this. If anybody wants, I can find the verses. Just post in the comment, and I'll find it, and I'll, be able to prove what I'm talking about. But basically, he's talking about how Adam corrupted the trees, again, which represents nature and ultimately the cosmos itself. He, in terms of like man's soul, because and Christ redeemed that. So just be aware of that. Now, another parallel with the trees is that trees, like I said, they represent Kabbalah, so they represent the spiritual light body of a human, right? So it's not just the body of nature, including the body of man, but it also represents his soul, right? Because remember when Jesus heals the blind man, he said, like, the blind man saw a vision, and Jesus asked him what he saw. He goes, I saw men as trees walking. That was a little like nod, a little hint to Kabbalah, right? That was a little hint to men as trees. Now, why are trees important beyond the scope of just Kabbalah, right? Well, trees, what they look like is they take the geometry of a tree, right? The form they take in nature is the magnetic field, right? And they also have a dielectric center, but we don't see that. It's basically the very center of the trunk of the tree, right? But the entirety of the tree, with the bough, up here being the northern end of the magnet, and the roots being the southern end, right? So basically, the trees represent magnetic fields, right? So just be aware of that. And so what they're ultimately talking about is the primordial atom, right? They're talking about the primordial form, which is related back to the sun, because the sun does this same thing. For instance, the outer part of the sun, the yellow part, and the rays that come off of it is the magnetic field of the sun, or the magnetic projection, and it's all coming from a dielectric core. And the sun in and of itself is an electrical generator. So anytime I talk about electricity or the fusion of the dielectric and the magnetic, which are both one thing, by the way, what I'm talking about is that primordial source of energy, right? That is that primordial soul. And God used that geometry of that field modality for all things, okay? The tree is just another symbolic representation. It's actually a very primordial representation of it, which is why it's so highly used throughout both mythology and religious texts and this and that. So another thing I want to bring up is the Hanged Man in the tarot. If you look at the Hanged Man in the tarot, right, he's hanging upside down, just like Odin, right? But his leg is crossed like this, right? Or, he's got one leg folded, and it's like sitting across his knee, which ultimately looks like the number 4 upside down, right? And why is that? Because the glyph for the 4 comes from Jupiter. Yeah, so because Jupiter is the 4x4 magic square, right? So again, what it's talking about is form, right? It's talking about form. And if you look at the thing that the Hanged Man is hanging on, it looks like a perfectly shaped capital T. So it clearly must be a post, right? Because no trees look like that. However, there are lots of vines and leaves that are hanging down from it to basically symbolize to us that it also represents trees. So, but the post, it's also technically a cross, because that's what the post is shaped like, right? So and I pointed this out before in previous videos, but when they talk about in the 4 Gospels, right, they talk about how Christ is crucified on a cross, right? That's how he dies. He's crucified on a cross, right? Which is that device made out of lumber, right? designed in that specific way. It's like a lowercase t, because that is like specific geometry that goes back to the cube and this and that. But I'm not going to get into that. Just remember that the cube, the two lights, right? The ice and the fire, sun and moon, trees, they're all representing the same geometry, which is the torus, which is the dielectromagnet, which is electricity. So just be aware of that. All of them are repeating the same fundamental primordial form. So they're all symbolizing the same thing. So just be aware of that. Like, for instance, when the green seers use the weirwood trees to look through, what they're looking into is the subconscious realm, the dream realm in this sense, the spirit world, or the light world in that sense, which is basically a negative of anything you see that's physical. The heavenly realms are not separate from the physical realms. No, they're intertwined. It's like the Force in Star Wars. It penetrates all physical matter. So the heavenly realm is like basically a mirror image, an internal, like negative. When you look at a photo negative, it's like the light realm, which is where all this is coming from in that sense. They can see through that through the trees. Which again, the tree, the outer part of the tree represents the magnetic, which the magnetic can be seen in the ferrocell. So that's what I say it goes physical, metaphysical, pataphysical. The metaphysical, even though it is invisible in the physical, can still be glimpsed and seen. For instance, a magnet under a ferrocell. But even when you do that, you still can't see the dielectric. It's still just a black hole. So the dielectric stays invisible. As far as we know, I don't know if there's any way that we can see, like, if there's any sort of form to the dielectric, right? But that's pataphysical, because again, pata goes back to paternos, all that. It's the Father. It's farther away. It's it's harder to see. That's the nature of God, the Father, right? The All-Father, which is what Odin represents, right? So, because again, even though it is a dragon character who violates the trees, it's that fiery spirit, which is what the serpent represents, that fire, right? It is the primordial desire within all life forms to extend, right? Fire extends, right? It burns, but that's just its nature. So what it's showing is like these parallels, going over and over and over again. It's like fires destroy trees, but eventually when the fire goes out and turns to ash, then the trees win because, there's always more trees. So it's all symbolic. Just be aware of that. Okay. So, but going back to, so basically what I'm talking about is seeing that spiritual realm. It's talking about seeing the metaphysical. It's about seeing that invisible force, that magnetism that's invisible, but it's still there, right? It's seeing that spiritual realm. But going back to Christ being crucified on the cross, right? That's what it says in the four Gospels. Now, immediately right after the four Gospels, in the book of Acts, at 3 different occasions, again, if you want me to corroborate these verses, just post in the comments and I'll share the 3 verses. But in the book of Acts, the disciples themselves are talking about, they're like basically talking either about, I can't remember exactly, they're talking either about the scribes and the Pharisees, or they're talking directly to them, and they're saying, like that Jesus was hung on a tree. They say that 3 times, right? And so it's just like, well, the disciples were there during the time that Jesus was crucified on a cross. Jesus even mentions, like, if any man follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. He's even referencing the cross, right? Which, it's not about the fact that it's a torture device, because clearly Christ wouldn't say, if any man wants to follow me, let him deny himself, pick up his torture device and follow me. He's not saying that. It's all symbolic. It's ridiculous. It's like, say, if Jesus had his head cut off with a guillotine or something, like most likely how John was beheaded, It's not like he would say, like, if any man wants to follow me, let him deny himself, pick up his guillotine and follow me. No, it's symbolic. It's symbolic because, again, the cross represents the net of the cube, which the two cubes, right, is the Kabbalah, hence why Jesus mentions paradise, etc., which means heaven, But anyways, so yeah, they mention that Jesus is hung on a tree 3 times in the book of Acts. Well, why? Because again, they're making that parallel between, with the trees, right? They're making that parallel again with the trees, right? And this is why, and I think it's Matthew 3, he's talking about how every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire, right? Every tree that is essentially corrupted, right, is going to be cast into the fire. Again, it's the symbolism of fire, right? The trees burning in this sense. And he says, and now also the axe is laid unto the root of the trees. Again, he's talking about the axe, right, which is a creation of man, right, which is a combination of like metals which come from the earth, right, and you form an axe in a forge, right? You have to smith it, right? So it's this combination of metals, which is earthly, and fire, which is fire. And fire and earth, that's another symbolism of the dragon, right? So, or at least the fiery serpent, right? Because you have to combine it with that spirit of air. But that's a whole nother thing with the spirits of the weirwoods, aka the others, and just the real world symbolism. Because George, all he's doing is he's just reiterating what already is in our world. Okay, so just be aware of that. The parallels with ghosts in trees is a whole nother can of worms. But I just wanted to point out that the same story of the invasion of the weirwood trees and the redemption of the weirwood trees is one of the same motifs that's being talked about in the Holy Bible. Because what did Adam do? He corrupted the tree. What did Jesus do? He basically redeemed the tree, right? Because again, the tree is he's redeeming spirit, right? He's redeeming the spiritual, which is what the trees represent, right? And in Hebrews, they also make that parallel. Paul, if I'm not mistaken, like I said, how with Adam's sins, he basically condemned all of mankind, and through the actions of God in man, which was Jesus, he was able to redeem mankind. So I was just listening to David Lightbringer's video on Weirwood. It was in the Weirwood Compendium playlist, where he had basically condensed the first 8 episodes into like 3.5 hours. And then I saw that bark fall off the roof, and it scurried across the ground, and I heard it sound, and I was literally just like lamenting, and things like that. And I just immediately realized that I'm basically a tree singer. I don't want to get into why all that is, but yeah, the symbolism is like right there in front of us. And if we open our eyes to our own world, we can see it. And then we won't feel like there's so many Christians out there who, it's like when I make references to the Bible being symbolic, which it is, right? Because another way to say symbolic is parabolic. And we know that the Bible is parabolic, right? Because Jesus speaks in parables, right? We know that Jesus is not a loaf of bread. We know that Jesus doesn't have a sword coming out of his mouth. We know that Jesus is not a rock. All that is parabolic, right? So we know that the Bible is parabolic. The question is not whether or not the Bible is parabolic / symbolic, which it is, because Paul was talking about the 2 covenants, he says is an allegory, the 2 covenants of the Old Testament. So it's not, the question is not whether or not the Bible is symbolic or not. The question is, how much so is it parabolic? Like, how parabolic is it? Is it just 5% parabolic, just when Jesus speaks parables? Or is it like 95% like parabolic? You know what I mean? Because you got to think about it. Jesus was a master of the dream realm. that spiritual realm I was talking about earlier, the heavenly realm that's inside the physical. He is a master of that and the higher dimensions. Why? And this will be the last point I make. When we read the Holy Bible, we imagine. When you read any book, you imagine what you're reading in your head while you're reading it, right? So it conjures up an internal imagery, a dream, right? A waking dream in your mind, and you're seeing Jesus walking around, doing his thing, hanging out with his disciples, all the aspects of the story you're visualizing in your head. Well, when Jesus sits down with his disciples and starts telling them a parable or a story, then he's conjuring up another image inside the original image. So you're imagining Jesus, right? And like in that time period, or whenever it may have been, because we don't know, there's no dates in the Bible. And that's the only source I trust completely, by the way, is the Bible itself. I don't care about men or anything like that. Psalms 118:8. But he's conjuring up an image inside that image in your head. So he's in those higher dimensions. The reason why he spoke parabolically is because he knew that was the realm, that was the dimension, right? Which is like the fourth and the fifth and the sixth dimensions, right? Going upwards. It's not dimension 3 and down, by the way. But at least as far as my awareness of dimensions go. But he also at one point says, when he's speaking to the disciples, he turns to whoever must be writing this down, and he goes, "Let him that readeth understand." So he's talking to the reader, and through whoever reads the Holy Bible at any point in time and at any place, he's talking to the reader. So he had the foresight to know that. All right, so Jesus is giving us higher dimensional messages in higher dimensions, and the most of the time we're not able to understand it is because our own awareness, our own spiritual understanding, which has physical organs to house that sort of fluid and that Christos, right, to those higher awarenesses, and we've been toxified, we've been brainwashed, and what we need to do is continue to read the Holy Bible, understand its deeper mysteries, realize that it is more parabolic than we think, because clearly Jesus is not an actual rock. But maybe we need to consider that maybe certain parts of it are more symbolic than we've previously thought, because what was it? Was Jesus crucified on a cross, or was he hung on a tree? Which is it? The book says both, according to both the accountants who wrote it, the disciples, right? The apostles. And also, how did Judas die? Okay? Check this out. Read Matthew 27:5 and read Acts 1:18. And the disciples, two different disciples, give two different accounts as to what happened to Judas after Jesus was crucified, or during and after. And they're both completely different. Now, is it for them to trick us, or is one of them wrong, and it's all about like needing to justify it historically because we need it to fit within the history handed down to us from the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and Vatican and stuff like that? But no. No, they had the foresight to write that down, knowing that it would transcend these lower dimensions. So that's all I wanted to say for now. I want to make a longer video regarding all this. Sorry I made it end up longer than I did, but it was just a vlog. So yeah, y'all have a good one.